It's been over a week since I've uploaded, a lot has happened. I just got back from Poland, so yes, I am back in the space. Also, I'm severely jet lagged yet again, so very fun. But also I got my nails done and I did a cool thing, so now you have to look at it. Look at that, I did a fade. It goes red to black. Ooh. Ooh, I've never done this before, but it's very funky fresh in my opinion. Okay, onward we go. Today's video is something new yet again, and I know that I've done ranking videos in the past, but today's structure is gonna be a little bit different, so let's get into that. We're gonna be talking about the most successful, highest grossing found footage franchise in the horror genre. We're gonna go over all of my thoughts on each of the Paranormal Activity movies in order, and I'll touch on all the most important behind the scenes information, all of the important historical relevance, things like that. Then I will interpret the progression of the franchise at my own will, getting very opinionated and whatnot. This will include the 7th and brand new installment of the franchise, Next of Kin. Then finally, I will do my ranking, including the 7th installment. I'm gonna try to keep this video mostly spoiler-free, but there will definitely be some light spoilers here and there for the franchise. Especially if I'm making a point and I want to provide evidence or something, there will definitely be spoilers here and there. And honestly, this is just my take right off the bat. I know that some people love this franchise, but I don't feel like it's necessarily worth your time to sit through all of these movies. So in my opinion, I think you could just stick around for the ride of this video. There are going to be some light spoilers and stuff, but like, whatever. The reason why I feel like it doesn't really matter that much is because the story gets a little bit messy the later in the franchise you get, and a lot of people claim this franchise to be very boring. So I don't know where you fall, it's up to you, and I'll let you know when a spoiler is coming, of course. And before I kick things off, I do want to let you know that the way that I did my research for today's video is I watched a brand new documentary on Paramount Plus. It's called Unknown Dimension, the story of paranormal activity. So that's where a lot of my information is coming from today. But of course, we're gonna kick it off with the first movie of the franchise, Paranormal Activity. It was directed and produced by Oren Peli, but Jason Blum also has a credit as a producer. Someday we might have to do a deep dive into Jason Blum's career because that man has made things happen. The horror genre has just been shaped so much by him, you know? He's also, of course, responsible for greenlighting Insidious, The Purge, Get Out, Sinister, Split, and most recently the new Halloween trilogy. So all that to say, Jason Blum. If you are looking for a sugar baby, just no, girl, we're not doing this. Sorry, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Paranormal Activity was so impressive because it definitely revitalized the subgenre of found footage. There was an absolute craze in the subgenre after this movie came out. Yes, we had the Blair Witch Project that came out in 1999. Shout out to me for being born that same year, by the way. But not much followed that if you're looking for major, memorable found footage films. The real craze started in about 2012 when other studios started to make them as well, and it was not just Paramount. Some of my favorites came out within the same 5 years of one another. We had The Bay, The Taking of Deborah Logan, As Above So Below, Creep, ooh, Hell House LLC, such an underrated movie. There are some outliers though. Of course, you have Cloverfield from 2008, and you have Troll Hunter from 2010, another painfully underrated masterpiece. But I think you get my point. In the early 2010s, found footage was that bitch. And I think that that can be accredited to Paranormal Activity. It was a trailblazer not only in found footage, but also in the haunted house subgenre. Insidious didn't come out for another 3 years. Oren Peli, the director, had always grown up living in apartments, and finally he moved to his own house for the first time with his girlfriend. It was the first time he ever lived in a house, number one, and the first time he ever lived in suburbia, which is quite a lot different to an apartment complex where you can always hear your neighbors moving around. In suburbia, the neighborhood is very quiet, while your house will end up making a lot of noise on its own. This was freaking out his girlfriend at the time, which kind of gave birth to his idea where he was like, well, how do you prove that something is happening while you sleep? You put up cameras. And then he thought to himself, well, that would be a really good idea for a horror movie. So a very impressive idea. Nothing like that had ever really been done before. But another reason why this movie is so impressive, and a lot of horror heads probably know this, is that the budget was only $15,000. They also rented the camera equipment, so they returned it and got some of that money back. Also, each of the actors were only paid $500 each. They barely even had a crew. Micah himself was also actually doing most of the filming, as you see in the movie. But he was super good at it, to the point where Peli had to tell him, hey, just close the viewfinder, you're doing too good of a job, it doesn't look handheld. And so he needed to shake the camera a little bit more so that the footage didn't look too clean. Chew on that one for a while. And they shot it only in 1 week in Oren Peli's house, saving God knows how much money on locations and studio rentals and whatever. Then it went on to make $200 million. 200 milli. So Oren Peli, not only does he shoot this movie in his own home, but then he tells the actors, yo! So there's actually not really a script. You guys are basically gonna be improvising this entire movie. And God bless, because that's like the only way to make found footage dialogue sound real. Case in point, the Blair Witch Project. Which, by the way, Oren Peli was very inspired by, and that's actually why he decided to have his actors improvise the whole thing. So this means the script for the movie wasn't written until after the movie came out, and this is a process called retroscripting. I also saw their audition tapes, and it's unbelievable how good they were at improvisation. It was one of those moments where you sit back and you think, damn, I am not talented. For the low, low price of free, you too can experience your own inferiority because I've linked the audition tapes down below. Which, circling back to Jason Blum for a second on this topic, did you know that he passed up the opportunity to distribute the Blair Witch Project? Where has this man not been? What I think is most interesting about sort of the release of Paranormal Activity is that they were planning on making a remake of it and distributing that. They wanted to make it a larger budget production and just have it be a DVD release. Peli would have been the director yet again, but then he would have had to redo all of his work, and he didn't want to do that. And so in fact, he kind of decided to sabotage this. He made a list of a bunch of conditions. He said that if you want me to do this, you have to do a screening of my original movie. And when they did that, the audience was leaving in droves, and when they later asked security what the people were saying as they left, they were saying that the movie was too scary. They did a lot of test screenings for the first Paranormal Activity movie, and Peli would just keep going back. He would do reshoots, he would tinker with it until he finally got the product that he wanted. And part of reshoots was thanks to none other than Steven Spielberg. He watched the movie, loved it, but he decided that he didn't like the original ending, which was very strange. In the original ending, police came in and killed both Katie and Micah. So Spielberg suggested something different, and that is the ending that you saw today in the theatrical cut. Before we get into all of my thoughts on the first movie, I just want to go over some other really fun facts that I found in the Unknown Dimension documentary. For the auditions, hundreds of people showed up. I think actually they might have said thousands. So they only took about 30 seconds for each person that came in. They were just going in and out, in and out, in and out. Because I guess that Peli kind of had an instinct once people came in, and he said that when Katie came in, she just immediately started acting. She was immediately in character, and I guess that probably set her apart from everybody else. Another thing that I found interesting is that for this movie, Peli did a bunch of home renovations on his house. I don't know if that's included in the $15,000 budget, but I want to guess that it's probably not. They also moved Katie and Micah into the house.
I basically moved into the bedroom that's in the movie, and then Oren and Micah took the guest rooms.
So they really lived on that set, and it's probably because it was not a union project. Obviously, the budget was very small. Also, the original title for the movie was going to be Captured. I honestly think that that title makes more sense than Paranormal Activity, but I do think that Paranormal Activity does sound way more iconic. And for my last fun fact, the actress Katie was still working at Buca di Beppo in the Universal City Walk right across from a cinema where the movie was playing.
And I'd do the whole spiel, and they'd be like, gee, are you there? And I'm like, yeah, I am. Yeah.
So wow, what a life, what a transition. That's about it for the historical significance and the behind the scenes information. So what did I think about this movie? Katie and Micah, a young couple, move into a suburban residence and feel the presence of evil forces. They install cameras which capture all the incidents, noises, and evil occurrences in the house. I honestly love the first Paranormal Activity movie. It's a 4 out of 5 stars movie for me. I knock a star off because the improv is mostly great. I mean, especially from the leads, but sometimes like there is a one side character that comes in, I think he's like a priest or something, and the improv in those moments is not great. Like you can definitely tell that these people are computing, and so the line delivery isn't the best. And this next thing, it's hard to knock the movie for because it was a trailblazer of this trope, but the whole demons dragging people around the house and some of the other haunted house stuff that happens, it's just kind of tired. It takes me out of the movie a little bit. I think that's mainly a me problem because number one, I don't believe in the demonic. I'm very open-minded though, I'd never write things off entirely. And two, because it's unfortunately been done to death since then. Like how many women have you seen dragged down a hallway by an invisible force? Unluckily, I can't wash my brain of having seen that so many times now, so when I go back and watch the movie, it's less effective. Everything else, mwah. I think the characters are extremely likable. I love the plot. I love that it really makes you pay attention not only to the dialogue for the plot progression, but in wide shots, it also forces you to lean forward and look into the corners and the shadows of the screen because you think things might be moving. And I don't think that it would have been as effective if it hadn't been made with this kind of guerrilla style of filmmaking. You really feel like you're in somebody's real house because it was a real home. The dialogue was extremely believable because it was all improvised, so it was quite literally real conversation. And because there was barely a crew and Micah himself was filming most of it, it's so believable that it's just this couple in their house filming each other. Because that's pretty much exactly what it was. Unfortunately though, I think that that might be the reason why the same magic wasn't able to be captured for the rest of the franchise. So on that note, we're now moving on to Paranormal Activity 2. This one was directed by Todd Williams, who has done nothing else of importance apparently. This time it had a budget of $3 million and went on to make about $177 million. Not quite as huge of a pop as the original, but still in the same ballpark. Initially they wanted Oren Peli to direct, but he was like, no, I'm retiring, I hit the lottery, so no thanks. So then one of their other initial ideas was to hire 10 different directors, give them each $10,000 and just see what each of them came up with. But then they were like, no, let's not. And I mentioned earlier that Todd Williams directed, but he was actually not the first director to sign on to the project. Saw 6 director Kevin Greutert had been roped in for the job, but then he was replaced because Lionsgate called him back and they were like, hey, actually, we need you to do Saw 7. They were taking advantage of some sort of contractual clause that he had signed, so he had to go back. So maybe that's why Saw 3D is the way that it is. So maybe Kevin was like, oh, I have to do Saw? Well then, this is what you get. Anyway, there's not too much historical relevance at this point. I mean, now it's become a franchise, it's very clear that it's gonna keep going on and on. So let's get into my thoughts on the movie. Family man Daniel installs security cameras in his new house after a break-in, but what follows over the next few days leads his daughter to conclude that their house may be haunted. This is also a movie that I give 4 stars because I couldn't believe how well they continued the story. This is kind of a big spoiler for the movie, and if you haven't seen the first 2 at least, then maybe skip past this portion of the video, because the first 2 movies are really great for a good double feature evening. But I love the fact that most of this movie is actually a prequel and it leads up to the events of Katie being possessed, and we get so many different answers about that. It's quite a bombshell because there's some family betrayal in there, and I love the drama. My main gripe with the sequel though is that it just couldn't distance itself far away enough from the original, and I do feel like I'm kind of watching the same movie again. A lot of the tactics they use for the jump scares just don't do it for me. Like the cabinet scene in the kitchen, it's just... I know that was a goofy edit, but for some reason that's how I see the scene every single time that I watch it. But fun fact, that actress had no idea that all of the cabinets were gonna open like that because she was only told that one of them would open.
So what you see on camera is the reality of me not knowing that all the cupboards were gonna blow open, and that is actually the first take.
Another scare in the movie that was a genuine reaction is when the teenage daughter is sleeping on the couch. They had been shooting for a really long time that day, and so she asked the crew if she could take a nap, and so she did. And then they decided to start rolling on her, and one of them banged on the walls, and so that's her genuine reaction waking up. So not a great movie, but why I give it so much credit is because there are a lot of very real moments like that, and there are a lot of really good atmospheric shots. Like whenever they're out by the pool, I just enjoy the vibes that gives off. And I think that the family is very likable and pretty realistic. I mostly admire the movie for the great continuation of the story though. The same cannot necessarily be said for part 3, so let's get into that now. Paranormal Activity 3 had a budget now of $5 million and it went on to gross about $207 million. So by this point, people are in it. It is the highest grossing movie of the entire franchise. And with this movie, it's yet another prequel, but they decided to really rewind the clock this time, and it's set in the 80s. It's following a young Katie and her sister, whose name I forget, and how they first encountered this demon. But before my thoughts, let's get into some fun facts, of course. Most of the scenes in the trailer were not seen in the actual movie, which did anger a lot of fans of the series. The production team apparently had enough footage to create two entirely different cuts of the same movie, so about half of that footage is what they used to create the trailers. There's also a scene where a little girl loses her tooth in this movie, and that was completely real. The director Ariel Schulman was like, hey, we can't fake that, let's work it in somehow, let's shoot this, which, gross, by the way. I hate seeing little kids lose their teeth, it's disgusting, I don't like mouth stuff. I also hated losing my own teeth when I was a little kid. That's besides the point. So the camera scene on screen Greene is a VHS camcorder, but what you don't know is that they hid a tiny little HD camera inside of that camera. That way they would have really good looking footage, and then if they wanted to, they could manipulate it afterwards. We also learned the name of the demon in this movie, I believe, right? We learned that his name is Toby. I'm asking because I just can't remember if we learned his name earlier than this movie, but I don't think that we did. Where's my lipstick? Did you move it, bestie? Where the hell is my lipstick? And get this, Toby was named after the writer Christopher Langdon's Toby was named after the writer Christopher Langdon's neighbor's dog, Toby, who was a chocolate lab. He decided to give the demon of Toby a very cute name so that a child would trust it. Let's get on to my thoughts with the movie, shall we? Siblings Katie and Christy live with their mother Julie and her boyfriend. Paranormal situations are triggered in their house when the two girls befriend an invisible entity named Toby. So prequels can be very hit or miss for me, but I was very excited for this one. It ended up being a pretty big letdown though, because unfortunately I just felt like I was watching the same movie again. This time it just happened to follow children. I think the reason why I wasn't really into it is because there had been so much exposition about these events in the first two movies, so I knew about a lot of the events of the movie before they even happened, and it didn't feel super necessary that we needed to see it. However, I do understand the direction. It was an attempt to do something a little bit more fresh, I guess. But there are so many recycled elements, there are still big scares in the kitchen, like, oh, whoa! The acting is pretty iffy from the kids, and a lot of it feels really predictable. The one new element that was very interesting that they introduced was the cult of Toby, or should I say the worshippers? I don't know. He has his own little fan club. So there's a wee bit of freshness, a bit of zest now thrown into the franchise. But can the same be said for part 4? Let's find out. This movie also had a budget of $5 million, but only went on to make about $143 million. Jason Blum is on record thinking that this and part 6 are the worst movies of the franchise that they did. The parents in the film were played by a couple that were together in real life. Their names were Alexandra Lee and Stephen Dunham, but unfortunately, Stephen Dunham passed away from a heart attack before this movie was released. So rest in peace, had no idea about that. This is also the first actual sequel of the franchise. The first two sequels were prequels. It was also the first movie to introduce filming yourself with a laptop, which definitely made for some more interesting moments in the movie. Alex and Ben are also playing boyfriend and girlfriend in this movie, but in real life, Katherine Newton, who played Alex, was only 15, and Matt Shively, who played Ben, was 21 at the time of filming, so ew. On that note, I am such a huge fan of Katherine Newton. I think she is such an underrated actress, and she's phenomenal in this movie, and the directors agree, they loved her as well. And they said the reason for this is because she had amazing improv ability, but she looked like a movie star. They didn't say it like that, I added the flourish. My personal favorite roles of hers are in Blockers and Freaky. Great movies. Anywho, Alex experiences strange events after she meets her neighbor's son, Robbie. Her life turns into a nightmare when all of her loved ones are murdered. So this movie was a very pleasant surprise until about the third act, which you might find out is a common theme. I thought Katherine Newton was carrying the story super well. The prospect of a strange child crawling into your bed while you're asleep is genuinely one of the creepiest things I could think of, as well as being secretly watched while you sleep. A lot of layers to that one. The suspense was building really well. I thought that the family was really likable. I was following the story and I was like, yes, and then I'll be damned if disappointment didn't strike again. In the third act, I felt yet again like I was watching the same movie over and over. I was so bored and I was tired of all the jump scares and all the different Paranormal Activity-isms. I think if I watched the movie on its own and not during a 3-day Paranormal Activity binge, then I would appreciate it a lot more. And I feel the exact same way about part 5, Paranormal Activity, the marked ones, so shall we? Online, it was very unclear to me. It has between a $5 million and $9 million budget, but it made roughly $91 million. So this was the first of the franchise to not break over $100 million in the box office. So it's kind of safe to say that a lot of people were over the franchise at this point, but there are more theories from the filmmakers themselves as to why it was not as successful. Number one, it wasn't marketed as much as the other movies, and when it was marketed as a spin-off. There was also some fatigue at this point. I mean, it's the 5th in the franchise, and by 2014, I guess not as many people were looking to see found footage movies. But anyways, to get on kind of with the development of this movie, Activity, the rest of the franchise had been very popular in Latin countries, and so they decided to cater to that audience. So it's worth noting that this is the first and only movie of the franchise to have a Latino-led cast. I think that's very fun and funky fresh because it was finally something that was actually very different to the rest of the franchise. Also, the lead was a street dancer, actually still is a street dancer in Hollywood. But his mom is a manager for actors, and so she had kind of always been pushing him to take on an acting role. So great, you know, Latino-led cast, it's the first time the franchise is truly trying new things, except for one thing that drives me crazy and why I give it a lower score than some of the other movies, so let's just get into the synopsis, we'll get into all my thoughts on the film. After the murder of Jesse's neighbor Anna, he undergoes a major transformation in his behavior. However, he remains unaware of the fact that his body is slowly being taken over by an evil spirit. As I mentioned, I love the new direction that they went, I love the cast, and the performances are genuinely fantastic. I think they did a really good job of separating this movie by its acts and giving each act a very different mood. It started as more of a sort of traditional teen rom-com kind of a moment, and then in the second act it was more of a straightforward teen drama, and then of course that transitioned into full-blown horror by the third act. And I only gave it 2.5 stars, which seems harsh, but here's the thing. I loved the first 2 acts of the movie. It was super different. I felt very involved with the story, but then came the third act. Again, I feel like I'm being forced to sit through the same things over and over, and this time there were some very weird, very questionable, different CGI effects going on. This is a big spoiler for the ending of the movie, so if you don't want to hear this, definitely skip ahead. So basically, there's a cameo at the ending featuring both Micah and Katie. It's the ending of the very first film, but it's just from a different point of view because now there's this kid in their kitchen with a camera. When I tell you, I am sick and tired of seeing Katie pop up at the end of every single one of these movies. It's just such an annoying crutch that these movies have, and I'm tired of it. I'm not really interested in her story anymore. Especially when you gave me such a rich beginning to this movie. I'm like, why did we have to end up back in that house? I didn't need to see the ending of the first movie from another point of view. I didn't need to mess with the canon of the first movie. I wasn't a fan of that. And I felt so hurt about the ending of the movie that it kind of like ruined my whole viewing experience. But nothing could compare me for the disappointment that I felt with Ghost Dimension. So, shall we? At a budget of $10 million, this is the most expensive Paranormal Activity movie to date, and then it only went on to make about $79 million in the box office, which is not technically a failure, but held up to the other movies of the franchise, it must have been quite disappointing. This one also took 45 days to shoot, and it was the first and only movie of this franchise to be shot in 3D. Good riddance. When introduced with this idea, Oren Peli said that he hated it. He thought that 3D would ruin the franchise, but apparently they'd been wanting to do 3D for a very long time at that point. And they also needed a hook and another reason for why audiences would want to come back and see the 6th installment of this franchise. But this and another reason might be attributed as to why it was such a financial failure. Well, not a technical failure. It was only released to about half of the theaters that all the original movies had been released to. So doing that would definitely hurt the amount of people that could go see the movie. Some more fun facts. I could not confirm this, but apparently Demi Lovato was offered a role in Ghost Dimension. The house in this movie is also used as a frat house in the show Euphoria, which I know is very popular amongst the kids these days. So let's get into my thoughts on the movie and why it is oh so terrible. Ryan, his wife Emily, and their 7-year-old daughter Leela are preparing for Christmas in their new home. After finding an old and mysterious camcorder, Ryan quickly learns that it can record strange apparitions that are invisible to the naked eye. When young Leela starts talking to an imaginary friend and displaying strange behavior, the couple soon find themselves in a terrifying battle with a supernatural force. This movie, woo, I was at the end of my rope. I was tired of Paranormal Activity movies at this point, and as soon as I saw the whack-ass CGI ghosty business, I was out. The movie could not keep my attention. I didn't like the characters. I thought that the concept was ridiculous. In my Letterboxd review, it got a half star, and I just said dumb. But that being said, it's not totally irredeemable, even though I gave it the lowest score that I possibly could. The CGI in the movie does take me out of it because I feel like they went way overboard. However, I do think that some of the special effects actually look really cool, but story-wise, I do not care. Do not care about this movie. It simply could not hold on to my attention, so honestly, let's move on. I feel like that's all you need to know. So now on to Next of Kin, the brand new movie in the Paranormal Activity franchise. They haven't released the budget information for this movie yet, and also the box office office numbers are non-existent because it went straight to streaming on Paramount Plus. It was originally conceived for a theatrical release, but then because of COVID, they ended up having to push it back, and then they just ultimately decided to release it to Paramount. This movie is interesting because despite sharing the title and the same demon as the rest of the franchise, it has nothing to do with any of the prior movies. It's also the 5th movie of the series to receive a rotten score on Rotten Tomatoes. It comes in at a whopping 28%. Because this is a brand new movie, there aren't that many behind the scenes featurettes that are out yet, so I'm just gonna get on with my thoughts on the movie. Margot, a young woman who was abandoned by her mother as a baby, travels to a secluded Amish community with a documentary film clue seeking answers about her mother and extended family. So I had considered doing a full review of the movie, but then I was like, nah. I have a lot of other better content coming out right now, to be honest. But that to say, this movie was not a disappointment to me at all. It was actually a very pleasant surprise, and it didn't disappoint me in the 3rd act. Quite contrary to my experience with the last 3 movies of the franchise that I had watched, the ending of this movie is what blew me away. I actually won't give spoilers for this one because this movie has nothing to do with the rest of the franchise, and I think it is worth watching. And I'm pretty psyched about the direction they decided to take with this movie and for the rest of the franchise. I mean, I'm assuming they're probably gonna make more at some point, although I have no idea why they slapped Paranormal Activity onto this movie. Just kidding, of course I have theories. So I think that somebody wrote a found footage movie about a demon and then they pitched it to Paramount Studios and then they were like, okay, but how is it gonna make money? So then Paramount was like, ooh, me, I will buy it, thank you very much, and I will just slap a franchise name on it, and that is how we will make that sweet, sweet dinero. So then that was going to plan rather well, except then COVID messed everything up, but then they went, hark, an opportunity. We can promote our weird-ass Paramount Plus and just make the movie straight to streaming, and more people will pay for our subscription. Big brains at Paramount Studios. I mean, I hope that worked out for them, but I have no idea. It's really hard to trust any of the numbers that come out about how many people view these movies that go straight to streaming, because there are no box office numbers, and I don't know if you're on Twitter, but people are constantly making jokes about the fact that Netflix always makes these crazy claims about their releases. They'll be like, wow, Red Notice was the highest viewed Netflix release ever. And it's like, okay, well, if I could just hide my own view count, then I would probably tell you guys the same thing. I'd be like, wow, did you see my last video? Because if you guys didn't know, it was like my highest viewed video ever. Like 1 billion people watched it. Anyways, back on topic, we actually just got Paramount Plus. My family did, so I'm mooching off of them. I'm very happy about it because now I can finally watch the iCarly reboot. I'm so happy. And a bunch of the Friday the 13th movies are on there, which is great because I'm gonna be doing my Friday the 13th comparison pretty soon. Anyways, tangents galore, my apologies. With Next of Kin, it's not a perfect movie by any means. They use a lot of gimmicks, like slow motion is a common effect that they use in this movie, but I don't hate that because they're trying new things, and admittedly, I think the slow motion looks really cool. On that note, it's also nice to see a found footage movie of such a high quality, because I could go out and make something like this too. It's never been easier to produce something of such high quality, but I can't afford a drone, so. Don't get me wrong though, older found footage like the Blair Witch Project is by far much more charming, but Next of Kin is definitely realistic to today's standards. But other issues with the movie, a lot of people are having a problem with the fact that there are some shots of the movie that are very clearly not found footage. There are just regular cinematic shots sprinkled throughout as if we wouldn't notice. So bizarre. I really don't know if I've seen a found footage movie ever do that before. It's like the biggest sin of a found footage movie. Just completely takes you out of it, and there are also some pretty tropey jump scares that I'm not a fan of. But other than that, I think that it is a pretty good movie. It's a lot of fun. At times I actually felt scared. I think that the characters are likable enough. I also love the setting. I don't think I've ever seen a movie take place in the Amish countryside, or at least not a horror movie. And the ending goes super crazy, which I love when a movie goes off the rails for a good reason. There was a lot of really good foreshadowing that led up to the events of the ending of the movie, which I always appreciate the attention to detail. So it's not a great movie, but I do think that it is a good movie, or at the very least a movie worth seeing. So taking all of that into consideration, all of my reviews and behind the scenes information out of the way, it's time to get into my ranking of this franchise. Going from worst to best, obviously, at number 7 would be The Ghost Dimension. This was one of the only movies in the franchise that was so dumb that I just couldn't be bothered to remember any of the storyline. Super gimmicky. I mean, every single time that one of the lame CGI effects was used, my eyes just glazed over. There was the rare occasion where sometimes they looked cool, but I mean rare occasion. Like the marked ones and Next of Kin, they swung for the walls, but unlike the marked ones and Next of Kin, they more or less just fell out the window, you know what I mean? So enough said, coming in at number 6 would be Part 3. Easily one of the more boring entries. I think the cast was likable likable, but just not great acting. And I also just get a little bit bored of the whole trope of like the child befriending the demon, mostly because it's never really sold for me. Maybe it's just me, but I was scared of everything when I was little. Like, I was terrified of the dark. So if I started to hear the voices of a demon trying to be friends with me, are you kidding me? Why is it in so many horror movies the little kid is like, oh yeah, that's just Toby, he's my best friend? I get that children have this innocence that makes them ignorant to a lot of the dangers of the world, but it's just always been a stretch to me. I think the only reason why it works in Insidious is because he thinks that he's dreaming, and also he's scared. Plus there are more kitchen scenes in that movie, and I couldn't deal with any more of that at this point. So then coming in at number 5 would be Next of Kin. I'm a little bit surprised. I thought it was going to be higher up on my list. To be honest, this is probably a better movie than Part 4. I'm just not as big of a fan of the subject matter of the movie. It ends up being more of a very straightforward demon movie, which that's just kind of one of my least favorite subgenres of horror. So even though I gave it more stars than a lot of the other movies in the franchise, that's kind of just purely out of my respect for the filmmaking itself and for the story. Because it was well made, it's just kind of not my cup of tea. Coming in at number 4 would be Part 4. I thought I was going to rank this one a little bit higher because I love Catherine Newton and I kind of love the concept of this movie, of this strange child that's just like coming over and he's sneaking into their treehouse and crawling into her bed. But at the same time, you can only watch a white family hear spooky noises in their house so many times before you start to lose your mind. I think it's definitely still one of the most underrated movies of the franchise though. It's also different because I think that the creepy child knowing the demon actually works in this movie because the kid himself is also creepy. It's not the demon that's doing all of this, it's the actual actions of the child like sneaking around and stuff that's actually frightening. And it was explained because he went through something traumatic. He wasn't like, oh, I'm just hanging out with my bestie, Toby. So yeah, if you haven't seen that movie in the franchise yet, definitely check it out. Coming in at number 3 would have to be The Marked Ones. I feel kind of bad putting this one here because, I mean, number 1, I only gave it 2.5 stars initially, and it's probably genuinely one of the best made movies of the entire franchise, but I was just so tired at the point of watching it. I was also so mad about the ending, just like the last act turning into another recycled jump scare fest. And then we were back in the original house and Katie and Micah popped up again and it's like, come on, like what in the fresh hell is this? So several of the cons just ended up outweighing the pros, unfortunately. So I just need to watch it again as a standalone and not as part of a Paranormal Activity marathon. I think I will have a much better experience doing that. But alas, it still comes at number 3, so not too shabby. Moving on to my number 2 on this list, and that would go to Part 2. I really like the continuation of the story in this movie, and if you know me well at all, you know I'm an absolute whore for a rich plot in a horror movie. So that's what carried this movie for me, that and the fact that the family was really likable, it had some decent atmosphere at some points. So that and the fact that the family was super likable is kind of what outweighed the cons of there being so many recycled elements in this movie. So while it maybe wasn't the most original, that's kind of inherent with the sequel, and you know, at least it was on brand. So moving on, obviously my number 1 of this franchise would be number 1, the very first Paranormal Activity. I'm kind of surprised by this because some of the other movies of this franchise are really good and they might deserve to be a little bit higher, but I think it's just the fact that this movie feels so authentic. And I don't mean in the sense that like, oh, I really feel like I'm watching real people, like, oh, did this really happen? My suspension of disbelief never really goes that far, but the acting is just so good that you really get sucked into the story of it. And while some parts of it maybe feel a little bit outdated now, it's because it was a trailblazer in the genre. So there it is, Stinkabutts, that is my ranking of the Paranormal Activity franchise. In terms of revisiting the franchise, I think the only movies that I really have an interest watching again would be 1, 2, 4, and 5. Next of Kin, or Part 7, was pretty good, but I just don't really see myself reaching for it in the future. It's not really my kind of a movie. Part 3 was boring. I don't think I'll ever have a desire to rewatch that one. It didn't entertain me, and with Ghost Dimension, you already know. So that does it for today's video. As always, I want to give a big thank you to my patrons. I love you. Thank you for your support. If you want your name to be featured and credited on this channel, then my Patreon will be linked down below. But other than that, let me know whatever franchise I should explore next. I've already done a lot of franchise series on this channel. That's kind of how I gained my initial growth, actually. So I've done like Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, The Child's Play, Scream. It's all out there. I also have a lot of other different kinds of content, some video gaming content. That's actually a brand new series that I'm starting, and the next video should be coming out within a couple days. But my favorite series that I've done to date that is ongoing right now is my original versus remake comparison videos. You can find the playlist on my channel and go to those videos, recommend whatever movies you'd like to see me do next, and as always, recommend me some movies. Let me know what I should watch this coming month. I don't know if you guys noticed, but for this video, I tried to kind of go with like a blue theme because, you know, the DVDs, they're all blue and it's kind of like a theme of the movies. And I kind of tried to do like a blue eye look, but it ended up just kind of being like purple. That's not relevant though, and that's kind of all I had to say. So drink some water, get some rest, and I hope I see you in the next one. Bye!